Hi folks, and welcome to Give Me the Remote podcast. It's episode 47 and we are on the 6th of August,
We're
Monday.
on the 6th of August, aren't
We're on that. We're literally on it.
we? Right. Recording on it.
Yeah.
Yes.
You might be on a different date, but we are on it. I am Sheridan.
Most awkward cover for a fuck up ever. Oh, damn language. I've done it.
Maybe you should stop pulling people up on their grammar and punctuation or whatever that was that I messed up. Phrasing. Oh, this is going to be a great podcast.
Who are you anyway?
I'm Sheridan.
And who am I?
You're John.
Hello!
And somehow we will muddle through reviewing the latest in streaming content.
The latest in streaming content. Yes. What do we got first?
Ooh, where should we go first? Let's start with The Boys.
Yay!
People love superheroes. They swoop out of the sky and save the day. People love that cozy feeling that superheroes give them.
So, a lot of folk in Australia might not have heard of The Boys because it's only available on Amazon Prime.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're shipping washing powder to your house every week, then...
Or Milo in an
perhaps
oversized
you do.
box.
I got a tin of Milo from Amazon last week, and it was sent to me in a box that was bigger than my dog, who is a medium to large sized dog.
The dog is certainly much larger than a tin of Milo.
Seemed wasteful, but...
But you know that guy slaving away in that fulfillment centre just needed to get some more orders done, and he had that box in front of him and that tin of Milo was going in it. Anyway, that does also give us Amazon Prime.
So The Boys is based on a comic book by the same name. So basically, how would you describe it? So the synopsis, if you should provide it with one, is that it's a alternate reality where superheroes are an accepted part of ordinary life, but they are controlled or, for the most part, controlled, I guess, by or owned by a corporation.
Yeah.
And there's, I guess, a top tier of superheroes called the Seven.
Yeah.
Made up of 7 superheroes.
Yeah. See, now you're getting into plot recapitulation rather than summary, but yeah.
My criticism on this episode is just difficult to deal with.
I would say one of the so it's got superheroes, but it's a very dark twist on superheroes. In some ways, there's a lot of sub-Tarantino dialogue going on. It's a bit like if Tarantino did a superhero thing. But I would say in some ways it's better than that, because whereas Tarantino is always about homage, this is deconstruction and criticism and satire, and particularly satire of power structures, which just happens in this case to have people who can fly and shoot laser beams out of their eyes involved. And what makes it so clever, I felt, was the way the opening started. You just thought there were kids running around talking about their favourite superhero movie, because part of the story here is that the superheroes who are real within the narrative of the show are also tied into the entertainment complex. So it's a bit like Marvel's, Avengers and Defenders and what have you. But there just happens to be real life ones that are also doing what turns out to be carefully scripted crime fighting. As well as their entertainment properties.
Yeah, there's, it obviously seems to have been based on some pretty good source material. I haven't read the comic books, but they went for quite a few series, so...
Apparently the world of The Boys is really big, and season 1 is just a tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, right. So The Boys are basically a group that's sort of loosely cobbled together group of guys who don't like the power and corruption that is occurring from the corporation and the superheroes, and they're trying to kind of reduce that power and deconstruct it or
murder a lot of superheroes.
Yeah, they want to murder the superheroes. They want to overthrow the superheroes.
And there is the boys are what is called in the intelligence game an external asset. And this is part of the cleverness of the plot of this is showing what I believe is quite realistically how external assets work, in that people within notionally the CIA have encouraged them and set them up, and certainly provided some hardware support, but not a lot. And if anything goes wrong, they're completely deniable, and will probably die in car crashes and, waving my fingers in air quotes here, kill themselves. And this is reasonably well known and well established to be how a lot of things work in the real world. But their mission here, and what they've been wound up to do through some what turns out to be pretty clever manipulation of them, is to go after these corporate-owned superheroes, which are themselves trying to take over sections of the government that, in this case, the CIA doesn't want a corporation horning into. Not that the CIA is particularly nice, but it touches on a lot of this stuff where people in America are kind of hoping that the US deep state will do something about Donald Trump, and without realising that could actually be worse than Donald Trump, although maybe not. Hard to say. But they do touch on this a lot, of things like Dominionist theology and the rallies. I mean, the rally where Homelander, who's the sort of Superman analogue, gives a big speech and floats out over the audience. That was a beautiful play on both the Trump rally and a religious revival.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, they've actually been trying to get this show off the ground since 2008. So it's not as contemporary as what you perhaps might think it is, but I guess they've chosen
this
the
production's
elements.
picked up a lot of those themes. And those things were out there before, but they're certainly a lot more relevant now. So obviously I'm deeply in love with the story here, but I also think the characters are up there with what I loved about Game of Thrones, in that even the most repulsive characters, there are things about them that you can empathise with.
Yeah, I mean, Homelander, who plays, like John said, that kind of, all-American superhero that you'd expect, played by Anthony Starr, who's actually a New Zealand actor.
Is he? Oh, this is a bit of a New Zealand show.
She starred in Xena Warrior Princess and not much else.
Because his performance in this...
He's amazing. I can't believe I've not seen him in anything else before, but fantastic.
The way he can look like a blonde-haired... everything you'd want from a blonde-haired superhero, and then just creep in hints
awful. He's evil.
But he hints of creepiness, hints of weirdness, and then the scenes where he's just cutting loose and killing people are just terrifying, with beams shooting out of his eyes. It's like watching Darth Vader at the end of Rogue One, which was, right up there with the greatest moments of villains on screen for mine. So what was his name again?
Anthony Starr.
Anthony Starr. Top-notch performance. If they gave out Oscars for TV, I would be voting him in.
So the main female character, I guess, there's probably two main female characters.
Three.
I think there's two main.
Okay, tell us about them.
So Stillwell, who plays basically like a VP of the corporation.
The Vought Corporation, which is a storied name in American corporate history, and a nice throwback, because the Vought Corporation doesn't exist anymore. But in the World War II, they were a big weapons company. And that's played by Elizabeth Shue in what I think
She's
is
great.
a wonderful role for her to be coming back onto our screens with.
The other main character is Annie, who plays a superhero called Starlight, who is new to the Seven, by Erin Moriarty. I think she's actually a very good actor, but unfortunately, I think the character sort of plays into a lot of, typical kind of trope. She gets sexually harassed at the beginning.
She plays the Midwestern naif.
Yeah, it's nothing really that original there.
I liked the way she played it, and I thought there was some really nice touches.
Same.
Her
but
relationship with Huey was actually
seen it before.
Pretty awesome. Yeah, you've seen it before, but it was still done well.
So if you're looking for some, strong female leads, you won't find it in this show.
What about the woman?
A-Train's... Oh, the... A-Train's girlfriend? Or...
No, that's Popclaw is A-Train's girlfriend, but the woman is the one they find and sort of ends up joining the boys from halfway through on.
She's, a minor character. She's the most interesting of them all. I can't remember the name of the actor that plays that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the really cool things, though, that you pointed out to me was Huey, who would be probably the main sort of protagonist.
Yeah.
Who he kind of... Well, basically the show starts with his girlfriend is horrifically killed by
it's in the trailers, so we can talk about it.
I think it's not a spoiler.
The speedster of the seven literally runs through Huey's girlfriend while he's standing on the street holding her hands, and he's left with the stumps of her hands in his hands. It sets the show up, because, I mean, the gore and horror that this is willing to go to is levels...
It's actually a very gory show.
Very gory show.
A really cool special effects, though. Anyway, so this leads him to go on to a journey to, avenge his girlfriend's
It makes
death.
him susceptible to the boys' blandishments.
But Huey's dad in the show is played by Simon Pegg. And in the comic books, apparently the writer watched Spaced, which if you haven't watched that is one of my all-time favourite shows.
We should do a Spaced episode.
We should. Based the original Huey character in the comic books.
No, Huey's dad.
He drew Huey because the comic book is 15, 20 years old.
Okay.
He drew Huey.
Okay.
Based on Simon Pegg in Spaced.
Yeah.
And so now Simon Pegg is playing Huey's dad, and they actually apparently approached Simon Pegg to canvas whether he would play Huey, and he said, "I'm not doing that. I'm way too old."
Good for him. Mm-hmm.
But I'll play the dad.
Nice one. Yeah.
So I thought that was actually a really cool little story.
And I'm going to say, Simon Pegg, his American accent in this is way better than I thought he was capable of.
You didn't even recognise him
just
as
because
Simon
I was
Pegg.
like, there's no way that can be Simon Pegg's voice.
But it's got some big names behind it. So Seth Rogen produced it.
He's producing a few comic books at the moment. We need to do Preacher as well, which has got one of Seth Rogen's other comic book adaptations.
And Dan Trachtenberg, who actually made one of the first probably famous YouTube film review shows called The Totally Rad Show, which I'm sure there's listeners out there who've seen that, but also directed, a Cloverfield movie. He's quite a well-known director now. He directed first episode and has an EP on it as well. So yeah, it's got a lot of support behind it.
Now, you haven't mentioned the most important character and actor in this whole project, though.
Carl Urban.
Yeah.
I think you have a man crush on Carl Urban.
It was funny, actually. I was talking with a colleague today at work about Carl Urban and how he does a lot of really good projects and seems to have a really good attitude towards things. Like he's really quite keen because he played Judge Dredd in the version with Lena Headey, and he's gently trying to help nudge that into a TV adaptation, which would also be really awesome because that Judge Dredd movie didn't do so great at the box office, but deserved better, and more people should watch it. So totally, if only for Lena Headey as the villainess in that as well. But, sorry, just the villain, I guess. Anyway, it turned out my colleague had a photo taken with him at a science fiction convention a couple of years ago,
Right.
and he told her she was pretty.
Oh.
And so she's pretty keen on Carl Urban on the basis of that. But he plays Butcher, which is a beautiful just name for a person. And it turns out his name's Billy Butcher. And it's a very complex character. And you're going to see a lot of this at conventions in coming years, I'm sure. In that he wears a long leather duster with a Hawaiian shirt, but he's very muscular within his Hawaiian shirt and his leather
I'm going to
duster.
honestly say I think Carl Urban's looking a little puffy.
Yeah, but that was the character, He was 8 years beyond his prime.
I think he's dyeing that hair now.
Oh, he's definitely dyeing the hair. I was thinking I could do the Butcher look, except for the grey hair.
Yeah, you gotta dye it.
But the character, and what I love about the character is he is the most terrifying thing in this show, and he doesn't have any superpowers. He does it on willpower and knowledge and ruthlessness, and he's up against people who can, explode stars and turn invisible, but he is coming for those bastards, and they are terrified of him, and that's wonderful the way it's done, and I really think Carl Urban deserves a lot of props for that.
So you got any criticisms of it?
Nope.
You didn't find there to me maybe a few too many characters? That it was a little bit too...
I like the ensemble thing. I thought it reminded me of what Game of Thrones does well in a lot of ways.
Look, I feel like this could... Game of Thrones season 1 was pretty good, but, Game of Thrones season...
3 was where it hit the high points, yeah.
It took a while, and this could go either way for me, I've got to say. The problem for me is...
Sorry, are you saying this could go either way for you for being as good as the most successful TV show
it probably won't, but I'm just saying, it's got real potential to be a really, really great show. I don't think it quite hits it. I think, a lot of the characters, especially the female characters, there's not a lot there.
It is a show called The Boys. But
that's not...
Elizabeth Shue's character is a interesting portrayal of a powerful woman.
Play the powerful executive who has a baby through unknown sort of insemination, and it's just a bitch. It's a bit of a played character. It's nothing unique.
And I know you weren't that keen on Starlight, although I found her quite captivating.
Well, I mean, of course she's captivating. She's an extremely attractive, nice character, but she's a bit meh.
And there was the woman who's terrifying.
She's the most interesting character, but she is a minor character, and she basically doesn't speak.
Anyway. Oh, if looks could kill, dear listener.
So, that's kind of my problem. Is that
I
found, and even a lot of the
one.
male characters were a little... I mean, A-Train's basically the jock that is just so stupid. And
what about his relationship with Popclaw? That was quite interesting.
That was the most interesting it got.
Mm-hmm.
I
think your jaw, when she had her big moment, and we won't go into it here.
I would agree.
Your jaw just hit the floor
but
and stayed there for longer than I've ever seen your mouth open.
Yeah, there's some really cool moments. I think it's a really great show. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying it's not. I don't think it's flawless.
I wouldn't say it's flawless, but I just I loved so much of it. And I mean, as I said, all of the characters have something about them. Even Homelander, who is repulsive and terrifying, when some of the reveals about his past, you actually go, oh, that poor guy. The Deep, who they set up straight away as a sexual assaulter. So you should just think he's horrible.
And then he gets sexually assaulted. But
not just him getting sexual assaulted, but when he tries to break the porpoise out of SeaWorld, and
who's interestingly played by Nate from Gossip Girl, which you probably don't.
I've watched Gossip Girl,
yeah.
But I think, and they do make that character interesting, even though they've set him up to be utterly contemptible from the start. And I like that interplay of lots of characters that are interesting and have some redeemable elements, even if they are vile, and other characters who are basically pretty good.
I agree, but it needs some more. I think it needs a bit more breathing room at the moment.
Well, and season 2 got greenlit before it even got released. So certainly the folks at Amazon who watched it said, "Yep, let's have more of that, please." And Amazon needs a lot more content, so that's good.
It does, yeah.
They do have the Lord of the Rings show coming up, and I believe,
really?
Yeah, and I believe there is because this does bear comparisons to Watchmen. There's huge comparisons to Watchmen. There is a Watchmen series coming up on Netflix as well, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read the source material, but Watchmen's an amazing novel in its own right.
Yeah. And I quite like the movie as well, but
yeah, I quite like the movie too. So what would you give it?
5 stars.
I'm going to give it 4 stars.
Okay, sure. So what's next?
Well, while we're on entertainment, we'll save the serious stuff till last. Let's do Derry Girls. Are we doing season 1 and season 2? Or?
Yeah, we may as well.
No funny business with these Protestant lads. I don't want anybody landing back here pregnant.
Not very likely in my case.
I wouldn't rule it out, son.
How do you rate? They're pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So Derry Girls is a show written by Lisa McKee. She was born in Derry. She's a British playwright. It's basically set in the 1990s.
80s.
No, it's the 90s.
Oh, okay, but pre-Accord.
Yeah, and follows a group of Catholic high school students during the Troubles. Oh, what was that?
It's all right.
I don't think that was an accent.
I think you got there.
So
there are soldiers everywhere. Is the how that's really used as a narrative device? That and the soundtrack.
It's a comedy, though. We should state it's a comedy teen coming of age.
Even
show.
a gross out teen comedy, I would say, is a part of its charm.
Yeah, 4 girls and one of their poor cousin James, who's a guy, who for what I have to only say is probably the stupidest thing in the whole show.
I think it might have actually happened, which is why they put it in there.
He's a guy whose mum basically can't look after him because she's going through a divorce and all sorts of just family drama.
She sends him back to Derry.
She sends him back to Derry, and he goes to the Catholic girls' school.
On the basis, they do explain that they've there was a risk assessment done and they couldn't send him to any of the boys' schools because he'd get killed.
Why?
Because it's Derry in the 90s and an young English teenager.
Oh, because he's English.
Yeah.
Right. I forgot that bit.
Yeah.
Anyway, it sort of adds a little bit of a cute element. He's a non-predatory teenage boy. So
he'd like to be predatory. He just doesn't get any opportunities.
Well, I don't think he'd like to be predatory.
Okay, well, he'd definitely like to be sleeping with girls.
Yeah, but that's different to being predatory.
He was very keen to get on with that Ukrainian, but... yeah,
it wasn't meaning he was predatory, though.
Okay, but he doesn't get any opportunities with the Derry Girls.
Yes, he's not... Yeah. He's woke.
I don't think he's that woke. He just doesn't have any opportunities to be non-woke. Anyway, it's funny. And that's the main thing. It is
funny, and it's endearing.
I've got to say, Derry Girls of the 90s struck me as being very, very similar to Australian Girls of the same era.
Oh, yeah, there were so many things. There's this scene where you see them all walking down the hallway and they have these ridiculous scrunched down socks that go halfway up their legs. And I was just like, oh my God, I used to wear my socks like that. There's so many moments that are like that if you grew up in the 90s as a teenager, because this is I would have been exactly their age. And so it's quite nostalgic. And it's actually there's some things about it that probably wouldn't have happened in the 90s. So one of the girls comes out as being gay and is wholeheartedly accepted by her family and everyone around her. And I sort of, when it happened, was a bit sort of annoyed because I don't think that would have happened in Catholic Derry. But at the same time, I thought, you know what, we're living in a different time now, and I actually think it's important that that is acceptable.
I didn't think it was completely unbelievable. Possibly they would have all just gone, sure, you're gay, and pat her on the head thinking that she was just...
I don't think she would have been as accepted without conflict as she is.
I do think one of the absolute stars of the show is Sister Michael, the principal.
Oh, yes, she's amazing.
And just as a woman who knows how the world works... And, there's...
she's a Catholic nun.
Well, this is a worldly Catholic nun, though, which is why she's allowed to run a school. She knows, she's always a few steps ahead of the girls. She knows exactly what's going on, and her droll observations and one-liners totally set the show up and make the show. And, the beautiful line of something like, when there was the possibility Bill Clinton was going to come to Derry, which he... becomes a big part of the show, and she just says something in front of the students like, I hope this doesn't happen because it'll give the Pope ideas, and that's the last thing I need. She's wonderful. Some of the interactions between the parents of the girls.
I think the mother, actually, of the main character, Erin. There is sort of it's an ensemble cast, but there is probably a main family and a main girl that it's about.
Oh, she's definitely the narrator.
Yeah. But her mum is great, and so the whole family living around Erin
I thought the relationship
fantastic.
between the dad and the grandfather, it was incredibly antagonistic, and I don't feel that they ever actually set up a reason why it was so antagonistic. So for me, that was actually a very minor failing in the broader joy of Derry Girls. I was just like, I don't get why this old guy is being so foul.
Because he's not actually a bad dad, yeah.
And the granddad doesn't actually seem like a bad guy in any way, except for his utter hatred of this poor dude, which I guess some families are like that. I'm not sure I'd stay keeping them under the same roof for too long.
Well, I mean, that's what Catholic families in 1990s Derry do, though.
Yeah. But in general, it's a bit of a blast from the past.
Apparently it's Channel 4's most successful show since Father Ted. So, if you liked Father Ted, here you go.
There's a lot of Father Ted actors in this show as well. A lot of Father Ted actors turning up in this show.
I just think it's well written, funny, feel good British comedy.
We literally blasted through season 2 in 3 hours of continuous
So
viewing.
each season is only 6 episodes of 22-minute episodes. So, and I actually sat there and said to John, "We're finished."
Yeah.
But
And
then I went, "What time is it?" And it was only 11, so it was
9. It was 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock, was it? So I think this is a great show. I think, and it's on Netflix, is it?
Yeah.
So what are you going to give it?
4 stars.
I think I'm going to give it 5 stars.
5 stars. See, I just don't think it's that great. I think it's great. I enjoy watching it. I laugh. Some of the setups are clunky as hell, but the payoffs are still side-splittingly funny. So I can forgive a clunky setup.
It's one of those shows, and this is something that you miss now with streaming, that if I turned the telly on and it was on, I'd probably have left it going, even though I'd already seen it.
Oh yeah, it'll be like The Office or Friends in years to come, where people will just watch it
It's
over
funny,
and over again.
but those shows probably don't have that repeat value, because you're not digesting them by osmosis, not osmosis, but just by default that they're on. You've got to be active now to choose.
Yeah, I mean, look, there was a period where Channel 10 in this country just played Seinfeld and The Simpsons non-stop.
Yeah.
And people just quite liked, and they sold a ton of ads on the basis of it, that people just liked tuning in and getting Seinfeld and The Simpsons.
I think it's like that.
It could be. I mean, we tend not to be, partly because we do this podcast, we're always looking for new things. The idea of just going back and watching old shows over and over again is a bit alien to us, but up until NBC took The Office back, that was 10% of Netflix's viewing.
Yeah.
Nothing but people just watching repeats of The Office. So obviously there is a market out there for just friendly, relatable, not particularly confrontational stuff where you can hear the same joke over and over again. Boy, let's start writing for that.
There's a reason those writers are highly sought after.
Yeah. Well, they're not enormously. I've heard friends writers talking about. I mean, yeah, they're not struggling, but they still have to work for a living.
Yeah, true.
Okay, so 5 stars from you, 4 stars from me. So we're on a 4.5 star average on the for tonight's podcast. So this is all content you want to get into you. So what's next?
Adam Goods, The Final Quarter. Actually, I don't think it's called Adam Goods, The Final Quarter. It's just called The Final Quarter. But it's about Adam Goods.
This is the documentary about Adam Goods.
Comfortable thing to talk about. It's definitely not a comfortable thing to go through. I decided to stand up, and I'll continue to stand up.
Who, for our international audience, is one of the most decorated and acclaimed players of Australian football.
And for our international audience, Australian football is a kind of football that is pretty much only played in Australia.
I think that was implied, but anyway. Mostly played in the southern states in Australia. It's not.
It's a weird game where they wear tiny shorts and kick balls a lot.
Which is like a lot of ball sports, but
there's not a lot of passing though.
Yeah, there is.
I don't know.
I've
got to be honest. I've never watched a game of AFL in my life.
So Adam Goods is an Indigenous man, and I think he twice won the Brownlow Medal, which is the.
He's a very, very decorated Australian Football League player.
And then he had the misfortune to be made Australian of the Year, which to an international audience might sound like a really stupid thing to do, but
Do they not do that in other countries?
No, they don't.
What do you mean?
Once a year, we choose an Australian and say this one's the best.
Hang on, I'm just a bit like. But in the UK, people get knighted.
Yeah, well, we have Order of Australia medals here as well.
Oh, so there's not an American of the Year.
No.
I've got to actually say, that has blown my mind. I've never really thought about now how naff it is that we just choose one.
One Australian and say they're the best.
And I have to say, overwhelmingly, they're sports people.
Sports people you can make a very good argument, are overrepresented, but they do give it to scientists.
There are a few scientists.
And they give it to diplomats and doctors who kind of are scientists.
Sometimes advocates.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes.
So it's a some would say it's a tragically dull list of the worthy, but it is an important thing because it does let the winner of Australian of the Year have basically a free kick of advocating for their causes, and isn't the worst thing in the world because some very worthy causes. Patrick McGorry for mental health, Fiona Stanley, Rosie Batty, who was domestic violence campaigner. So this institution of Australian of the Year, despite sounding a little weird to anyone who isn't an Australian,
it's picked by an independent committee who is government appointed, but there's a little bit of an arm's length from government. So.
There is. Anyway, in 2014, I believe they made Adam Goodes the Australian of the Year, and there then followed, not entirely related to that, but contemporaneous at least, 32, I think, continuous weeks of Adam Goodes being booed by crowds whenever he played football over the course of 3 years.
And so early on in that booing period, kind of all really kicks off when he's playing football and a 13-year-old girl calls him an ape.
Now, she was a Collingwood supporter.
And he played for the Sydney Swans.
Well, Collingwood are famous as Collingwood was, it's gentrifying now, a very lower working class suburb in Melbourne. So their fans have a reputation for being the rough ones.
There's a lot of tribalism in the game.
There is, and so the jokes about, there was a few years ago Collingwood drew in the grand final and everyone was posting jokes on Twitter about how this is a great tragedy because Collingwood fans have already spent all their unemployment benefits and won't be able to afford a ticket for the replay.
Anyway, he pointed this out to the guards,
officials,
the match officials,
yeah.
And she was ejected from the game, which was their decision.
So did we say what she did?
Yeah, she called him an ape.
Okay, sorry.
Now, what happened the next day was there was quite a bit of outcry that a 14-year-old girl was ejected, and he said,
"Well, there was a lot of backlash against her."
Yes.
And a lot of people reasonably rightly say, this is disgusting, but then you got the whole angry mob thing forming, and to his credit, not that he got a lot for it in certain circles, he was actually leading the group saying, hang on, it's just a 13-year-old girl, she should, be educated, she shouldn't be destroyed for this for a whole life.
And he came out, very openly and said no one should be blaming her, that's not her fault at all.
But the worst people in Australia, of which there are many, particularly in the sports media and on breakfast television and on our radio stations, decided to launch a crusade
very senior people within AFL, like Eddie Maguire, who is
the president of the Collingwood club. So
yeah.
He has skin in the game, launched a crusade against Adam Goodes for how dare he be mean to a 13-year-old girl.
Which, of course, he never was, because he never ejected her. He just
said she called
raised the issue with the officials. Anyway, so what continued was pretty much 3 years
of continuous booing every time he touched the ball.
Of him being continuously booed at every game. And so what this documentary does is it takes archival footage. There's absolutely...
And, sorry, just to set the scene there, when we say booed, we're talking about tens of thousands of people in unison booing the Indigenous man who is was the Australian of the Year for no particular good reason other than that we are a racist pack of bastards.
Yeah.
They didn't think that was why they were doing it, but it was actually why they were doing it.
Yeah. And so what this documentary does, it takes completely archival footage. There's no commentary, aside from...
There's no contemporary commentary. There's no
contemporary commentary, no. There's no voiceover or anything. Perhaps the only interjection, other than obviously the editing of the material
there's
into
a couple
narrative.
of subtitles, but
there's some, what I think were fairly... not very particularly useful definitions, like what racism means from a dictionary, which I found a little
You might have found that patronising or condescending, but this was aimed at an audience who like football, so they need help.
Well, anyway, it's not...
You needed help with the football, they need help with the words.
They didn't give me... To be fair, they didn't give me any help with the football. So other than that, it's completely from archival footage, which is, probably the strength of the documentary, because it's, that was what happened.
And that's what they said. And it was mostly media types in Australia just hanging themselves by their own petards. Sorry, you hoist oneself by a petard. But they definitely did that.
So look, I think this documentary is a really, really important documentary for all Australians to watch.
It's interesting when a documentary just becomes a document.
Because I don't like AFL. I'm not an AFL fan. I'm not even any sort of football fan. I would occasionally watch the league. So I didn't feel as though the message was that important for me. But when I watched it, I realised this is actually an important message for all of Australians. And I think what it highlights is, because, the constant thing that everyone said throughout that period was, but, they're not booing all the other Indigenous players, so it's not racist.
It's because the other Indigenous players weren't standing up to the racism.
And that just... And that's not meant to be pejorative of them.
No, but he had made himself a lightning magnet. And there is the issue that he did a little tribal dance in the dedicated Indigenous round, it should be noted. But he did a tribal dance, and suddenly the idea of a strong, powerful Indigenous man making any sort of threatening gesture to white folk set off the ancestral memories of the racists and murderers of Australia, who were used to doing horrible things to our Indigenous populations. And that was particularly weird and wild, and in a way useful for the country to look at. I remember particularly, I was writing for a magazine at the time this was coming to a head, the third season of the booing, and I wrote an editorial about it, and I'm glad I was on the side of the Angels on this, that I was writing about how terrible it was, trying to explain to a mass audience who might not follow AFL what the hell was going on. And the graphic designer who was doing the page layouts in this magazine, her son was an active Adam Goods booer, and he was only about 18. He probably didn't know better to some extent.
Well, that was his point the whole time, though. You know, there's a lot of kids that were doing it that were just doing it because they didn't know better.
Because everyone else was doing it. Anyway, she sent this article to him and asked him what he thought about it. And he actually came into the office and got a little shirty with me saying, we're not doing it because we're racist, we're doing it because we think he's a flog. And I said to him then, as I'd say now, you think he's a flog, but the reason you think he's a flog is racial. Mm. Because there's tons of dudes, guys like Jason Ackermanis, who was as white and admittedly bleached, but blonde as you can get, was an absolute flog, and everyone loved him for it. He was a character, he was a larrikin, because he was conforming to our dominant tropes.
And I mean, this guy was an Australian of the Year, and as far as I can tell, the only thing that he did that anyone could possibly open criticism to was tell a match official that a person in the audience, who happened to be an underage person, but...
He had no way of knowing her age when he called it up.
But whatever, he just said to a match official, that person over there racially vilified me. That's all he did. And then another match did a tribal dance in front of the crowd when he scored a try.
And kicked a goal.
Kicked a goal. Do they not score tries in AFL?
There are no tries in
right.
AFL.
Anyway, lesson learned. So they're the two things he did. That's all he did.
Yep.
And
he was handed out of the game.
He was Australian of the Year.
And in AFL terms, dual Brownlow medal winner, which is when you're named the best and fairest in the code in a year. Very hard medal to win the way they do the scoring system. Twice winner.
And so if that doesn't say to every other Indigenous person in this country,
know your place.
Get back in your box, I don't know what does, because... And it's a heartbreaking documentary to watch.
Yeah. Now, for the international audience, we'd note that we have talked a lot in the past about race in America, which I'm sure anyone who's still listening to us who listened to that didn't totally disagree with us. But this is a good reminder, because in Australia we try to pretend we're not racist a lot. And,
yeah.
And it's...
But we're deeply racist.
There is a point in this where Adam Goodes is talking, I think in a radio interview, and saying things that would be entirely unremarkable in any moderately educated audience. Certainly would be the consensus in any university common room. But you don't need to be that educated for this to be normal, where he talks about how Australia is predicated on the eradication of Indigenous identity. And if you understand Australia's constitution, that's not a remarkable statement. That is 100% true. Australia was legally founded on the basis of the eradication of the First Nations. And yet he says it, and all these buffhead sports commentators who don't know a damn thing about what they're talking about screech in outrage.
I think too what this did really highlight, and I'm not saying it should be this way at all, because I think there's a whole bunch of Indigenous people out there who have a right to screech and outrage just as hard as the white people in this show did. But he, throughout it, is just a very gentle... he's not angry, he's very measured, and for the reaction to happen, especially to a person like that, and I'm not saying that Indigenous people shouldn't be outraged and yell and scream, because I totally think they should, but there's nothing in his character that even deserved this.
No, they do quite a good job of showing his family life.
He's just seemed like a really quite nice guy for what was happening to him.
Intriguingly, they've got quite a few interviews with his mother in this, and I did think when his mother was trying to front up to the cameras and ask the football fans not to boo her son, that was a little ill-advised on her part. Not because the sentiment was wrong, just because you're not...
After 3 years, though.
Yeah, but you're not going to...
Finally, your mum just wants to come out and go, bugger off.
Yeah, but you never... In the world of men, anytime your mother's sticking up for you, that creates more problems than it helps.
In Australia, I mean, a lot of people, especially international audience, wouldn't know. I mean, in Australia, Indigenous men are often portrayed in Australia as being violent and outspoken and angry, and he is not that at all. And
No, it was the whole thing was grossly unfair, and that is the strength of it is just how gross that unfairness was. And when I say gross, I mean in terms of the large amount, although either version works really. I did think it was interesting for me that in some of the interviews with his mother and he, that apparently he'd been in his teenage years before his mother had even talked to him about their Indigenous heritage. Now looking at him, you'd think, that seems reasonably obvious, but I thought that was an interesting thing as well. I think, and it's a good thing, a lot more people with Indigenous heritage are talking about that now, and that's some sort of positive going forward.
But yeah, I mean, this wasn't very long ago, and it
was literally 2 years ago.
I just think this, it just disgusts it. It disgusts me, watching it motivates me to try and do something to kind of correct the way of, the issues of colonisation. And, often you don't know how to do that, but I think it's always important that we have a responsibility as white people in Australia to, try and fix it.
Stay tuned, folks. We've got a history podcast coming up soon on the channel. Anyway, I think this documentary, while I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a perfect documentary, and
no,
its total reliance on archival footage is something that some would call lazy documentary making, but I don't think I will. Although I'm
all about reusing archival material and a creative reuse.
But I some people will, and there is a upcoming rival documentary on this that Stan Grant's done, who is probably the most prominent Indigenous person in Australian media, having made his career
in America.
In America and Asia, yeah.
He was basically like a breakfast TV show host, wasn't he, in America?
Well, he hosted CNN for Asia from Hong Kong.
Yeah, right.
But I believe he's done a lot of other things that
He has it's nothing to do with his Indigenous heritage, but his Australian accent is very NBC.
Yeah. But anyway, so Stan Grant is a very serious, intelligent Indigenous man.
There's rumours he's going to join the Liberal Party, so we can't. Well, he's not all good, but
I wouldn't say he's all good, but he's a serious, intelligent.
He is. He's
well-credentialed.
I think he's fantastic.
Yeah, and he's got a documentary coming out where he's got new interviews about the subject, and I'll be really interested to see what that. But this one, in terms of laying out what happened, when it happened, how it happened, and it was played out so much in the media with these horrible people making statements on camera. It's important as the document.
Yeah, I agree. I think it, just having it as, and it is actually quite captivating. It's not very long. It's only about an hour and 20 minutes, maybe 15
It's long
minutes.
for a documentary, but
it's a bit over an hour. It's definitely watchable. I think it's your responsibility as an Australian to watch it. You can watch it on 10 Play, I think free at the moment.
Yeah, the Channel 10 catch-up service. So if you haven't seen it, I'm going to give this 5 stars and even say that any Australian who hasn't seen it should see it and should have a long, hard think about what sort of country we are and what sort of country we would want to be, because this country has never been a perfect country, but in our past there have been times where we've tried very hard to be a better country, and I feel like we've stopped doing that, and we need to get back to being a country that for a long time led the world as being as good as a country could be, and we need to work on that again.
Yeah, and I'm going to give it 5 stars as well. I believe the filmmaker is also Indigenous, which is, obviously important. So yeah, I'm going to give it 5 stars.
Okay, and on that note, thank you everyone this has been a really long one from us. Thank you for listening all the way through.
A lot of good shows. There was a lot of good shows.
Yeah, a lot of good shows. We've still got a ton of content to talk about too. So thank you for listening. Do please send us your emails at gmtrpodcast@gmail.com. We do like to read them out, and also just leave comments via any of the social channels in which you find us or we appear. And on that note, I bid you a good night.
Hey, thanks, folks.